And with that, Julie, you're our first moderator.
Hello, everyone. I'm Julia Neisel, the Shoreline and Floodplain Manager with the Office of Coastal Zone Management, just over across the river. And I'm really excited to get the session started this morning. Yesterday, we spent a lot of time talking about mapping high water in our coastal communities and also riverine areas. And now we're at the point where we're going to kind of set the table for discussion on adaptation strategies. And yesterday, Jamie Rome described quickly the difference between the flood insurance rate maps and the hurricane surge inundation maps for evacuation planning. And this morning, we're going to actually provide a little bit more detail on the National Flood Insurance Program, and then from there, kind of broaden the discussion and talk about other hazard mitigation and adaptation strategies. So this morning's panel is a great lineup of experts that have amazing experience with the Federal Emergency Management Agency, private insurance sector, as well as other amazing opportunities for dealing with these disaster events in communities. So Rich Zingarelli, the state's manager for the Hazard Management Program with the Department of Conservation and Recreation, is going to get us started, and then we'll go from there. So thanks, Rich.
Thanks, Julia. I'm going to try, I don't know if I can possibly do this, but I'm going to try to give you a very quick overview of the National Flood Insurance Program in 15 minutes. It's a presentation that I usually take an hour or more to do, so I'm going to sort of fly through here, but we'll see what we can do here. So the Flood Insurance Program, it is established by the National Flood Insurance Act of 1968. It's a voluntary program for communities where they enter into an agreement with FEMA, and under that agreement, they, in exchange for having flood insurance available to their residents, they agree to regulate development to certain minimum standards that are established. Why do we have the Flood Insurance Program? This comes from the original National Flood Insurance Act in 1968. And it's amazing to me how true these words are still today. That's kind of a scary thought in some ways. But basically, it's a recognition at the time that flood disasters were causing economic hardship and a burden on people. And there needed to be a system of dealing with that hardship and that burden, that it was not being taken care of by structural measures and protective measures alone, and there was not an availability of insurance through the private sector. So Congress felt there was the need to establish this national program to help individuals to be able to deal with the hazards of flooding and the impacts from that. And then the intent was also that as part of that, there would be measures put in place to manage development so that eventually this program would be not as severely needed. So when they structured this, there were three basic elements to the program. There's an insurance side, a mapping side, and a regulations side. And essentially, insurance that would be backed by the federal government would be available to residents of the communities that participated, and there would be a requirement that as the flood hazards were mapped, then there would be regulations put in place to manage development in those recognized flood-prone areas. I'm going to cover fairly quickly the two aspects, the insurance and the mapping aspects of the program. So on the mapping side, FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, produces flood insurance studies and maps, and those maps are what identify and translate to the public and to people involved in the flood insurance program what the risk is. But they're also used for a number of other purposes as well. One of the key things as part of that is to determine where flood insurance is required. There's a mandatory purchase requirement for flood insurance if there's a federal loan within for a structure that's within the mapped flood-prone areas. And these maps are also used as a basis for determining the premiums for flood insurance. The flood insurance studies, and I'm glad to hear that you had a little bit of introduction to this yesterday because I'm going to have to go through it fairly quickly. There's really three parts to what makes up a flood insurance study and what's behind the flood insurance maps. And this is true whether you're talking about riverine areas or coastal areas. They're just done differently. There's a hydrologic study which tells you how much water would there be during a flood event. And what is standard for use that was established by Congress and the National Flood Insurance Program early on is what was called at the time the 100-year flood. That term is still used, although we're trying to get away from it because it's confusing to people. They think that if they have that flood, they're safe for another 100 years, and it doesn't quite work that way. So what we're now calling it is the 1% chance annual flood. It's a lot more of a mouthful, but it's more accurate in terms of what the flood risk is. So during that 1% chance event, we're looking at how much water will there be at a particular location. Then there's a hydraulic study, which will tell you how high that water will get, either in a river or stream or along the coastline. And then finally, a topographic analysis, which looks at ground elevations and then translates those elevations to areas that would be inundated from that 1% chance event. We have here sort of I'm pretty sure this is the first flood insurance map that was developed for Massachusetts back in 1971. You can see they were quite crude at the time. We didn't have a whole lot of modeling, a lot of computer power to develop the maps, and they pretty much just designated areas that were prone to flooding. There wasn't a whole lot of information in terms of flood elevations. There wasn't a whole lot of information in terms of the variability of risk within those areas. As you can see, this map dates to 1971, so it was fairly early on in the flood insurance program. But that was quite a long time ago. That was over 40 years ago. How long ago was that? Well, at that time, there was a young engineer-to-be who came to MIT, kind of a lost soul, as you can tell from that picture. He came to MIT. He learned to program in Fortran on punch cards. He studied waves and measured water flow in buckets in the Parsons lab across the way here. And he studied physics by throwing pianos off the roof of his dormitory. And at the time, you can see what the vision of that last slide and that last picture in the bottom right-hand corner is what the vision was for what a home computer would look like in 2004. I'm not sure what the steering wheel is there exactly, but I guess that's a mouse now. I'm not positive on that. But thankfully, we've moved quite a long way from there over the years. I'm not going to go through this, but this is kind of the history in terms of coastal floodplain mapping as we learned more and more about how flooding works, what key things affect where areas flood. We learned things like that should be fairly obvious, like the fact that dunes don't stay in place during a major storm, they actually erode. When we did maps originally, they were mapped as if they were stone or concrete and they would stay in place. We learned things like waves don't just stop at a seawall. They actually come over seawalls and flood areas behind the seawalls. So we've moved quite a long way. And this is a little bit, this is an indication, it's a very similar area. It's right where that original map was. And I think this is all for the better. It's a lot more complicated, certainly. We have a lot more information in terms of flood elevations. We have different types of zones. We have velocity zones, VE zones, which are the areas where you expect to have serious wave action that will cause a lot more damage than the A zones, which are areas that have lesser wave action. We have flood elevations, which vary throughout the floodplain. And the other thing that we have is we now have these available digitally so that they can be overlaid onto aerial photos, as you see here, but they can also be overlaid onto information that cities and towns might have in terms of assessors' maps, in terms of structure locations, or basically anything that they want to compare. How do these features compare to mapped flood-prone areas? So I said we've kind of come a long way over the last 40 years. These are some of the things that have changed recently or brought recently into the coastal flood studies. A lot of technical things, as I mentioned. We've kind of recognized that dunes don't stay in place. We look at the fact that coastal structures like seawalls might fail. But you might look at this and say, boy, there's something that's missing here, particularly in the context of this symposium. And you'll notice that one of the things that's not listed there is climate change or sea level rise. And you're probably going to ask yourself, why is that? Well, the thing is, the flood insurance rate maps are used for a number of purposes, as I identified. But first and foremost, they're an insurance tool, and they're used to, as I said originally, they're used to calculate the flood insurance premiums. And so when you buy flood insurance, you're buying a policy for the next year. And so when you figure out how much that should be charged for that insurance, you're having to consider what is the risk of being flooded in the next year, and how severely might you get flooded in the next year. So it's not how severely will you be flooded 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, or 100 years from now. Now, the maps are really, as I said, used for a lot of other purposes. They're used for regulating development. They're used for planning. So it's really important to recognize, as you use these maps, that they only reflect any climate change that has occurred up until the point at which the engineering studies were done. So sea level rise that has happened up until the study was done, you know, the foot of rise roughly that we've had over the last 100 years, that's been incorporated into the maps. But what's going to happen over the next 20, 50, 100 years is not. So that's really important to recognize. Okay, now about the flood insurance side of the program. It's available to all residents of the communities that participate in the program. And here in Massachusetts, virtually all cities and towns do participate in the flood insurance program. A key thing about the program is that as it was originally structured, the idea was that the money that was received from premiums of policyholders would be sufficient to run the program. So it'd be sufficient to pay out claims. It'd be sufficient to pay the cost of running the program, developing the maps, all of the work for people that are involved in managing the program. And people like myself at the state level, the state coordinators for the flood insurance program. But there was built in, there's a recognition that, you know, costs are not constant and claims are not constant. So there was the ability for the program to borrow from the Treasury if at any point claims got too high, and then repay that money with interest. So we've gone along in the program for a while, and things were working fairly well until recently, and I'll show some slides that show just what had happened. But the program started running into a deficit, and one of the key reasons Congress felt that this was occurring was there were a subset of policies that were subsidized by other policyholders. These were policies for people whose homes were built before there were flood insurance maps, or people who had changes to the flood insurance maps while they still had a policy. Those premiums were subsidized, and to the point where something like 20 to 40%, depending on where you're located, of the policies in the program were actually subsidized and weren't paying the rates that you would expect on an actuarial basis. So Congress passed this law, the Biggert Waters Act, which you may have heard about, which brought in increases, pretty substantial increases, 25% a year on certain classes of pre-firm policies, and set up a rule that any new policies would be rated at full actuarial rates. And this is what happened. There was a firestorm, basically, as people felt their rates were going up too fast, the rates were unaffordable. I never, when I started in the flood insurance program 20 years, if you look at the lower right-hand corner, I never thought that there would be a political campaign where people were showing that what the rates were being charged for flood insurance as a result of a bill that a sitting representative voted for. And this was the reaction, and it went like a firestorm. Congress responded as Congress does when they hear a lot of negative reaction to something that they've done. Some might say they overreacted, but as a result, they passed a new bill in 2014 which delayed or removed a lot of the provisions of the Biggert Waters bill, removed a lot of these increases on subsidized policies, removed the provision that new policies went immediately to actuarial rates. And this is now in the process of being implemented. So where are we now and where are we going from here in the flood insurance program? This is sort of give you an indication of where we were over the first 20, 30 years of the program. Things looked like they were in fairly good shape. Here at MIT, I have to throw an R squared in there. Even though my wife told me, who's also an engineer, you couldn't do an R squared on the claims because they bounce all over the place. And I said, that's why it's 0.46. So we were here. Things were going along fine. Premiums and claims following pretty closely. And then we had Katrina. And it basically threw the program into a huge deficit. But there's this provision, we can pay it back, right? And we go along a few more years and we're actually doing reasonably well. Premiums are much higher than the claims they're paying. They're actually making a dent in the deficit. And now we have Sandy. So where are we? What is the future going to look like? Is it going to look more like the first 20 years, or is it going to look like the last 5 or 10 years? There's a slide that shows what's happened with the deficit, the red line there. And so very quickly, and I hope they'll have some discussion from the next presenters, what kind of options do we have? I'm not going to read through these. These are just some of the examples of ways that this can be approached and some of the problems that people have raised as to those possible approaches. But I want you to look at the last one, because even if we do some of those first things, I think the key is going to be that we're going to need to reduce the need for insurance by changing how and where we build and rebuild. So thank you very much. I hope I've given you a fairly decent overview of the program, and I really enjoyed being here.